The world forgot the silence of the open range. The moment the steam engine's roar became the sound of progress. A solitary old man remains, stubbornly rooted in a dusty homestead, now an island besieged by the tide of modernity. He sees the relentless advance of steel and wire as a physical dismantling of everything he ever built, everything he believed the West stood for. This dilapidated house is his final stand, a monument to a life forged in the fire of the frontier and governed by the ache of profound regret. Every day is a relentless vigil, keeping guard over a front door that serves as the last remnant of hope. He waits for a ghost to cross a threshold that marks both a desperate love and the final, crushing certainty. The frontier vanished, and he was swept away with it. The bellow came again, not from the throat of a long-horned bull or the thunder of a high plains storm, but from the belly of the iron ghost, screaming its victory over silence. That deafening, rhythmic clatter was the only clock I truly heard anymore, marking the hours not by hands on a dial, but by the relentless, calculated intrusion of progress. My name is Silas Thorne, 80, and the world sees only the gaunt, stubborn man clinging to a collapsing ruin. My face is a map of arid regret, weathered by suns that set on a century that is no more, and my hands, rough as tree bark, move slowly, deliberately, only serving the purpose of keeping this failing homestead standing for one more day. I am a monument to waiting. The year is 1935. Economic pressure is a tangible vice squeezing the last air from the independent man, and the very ground beneath the thorn vigil trembles with the ambition of men who measure life in dividends. My two-story house, once proud, now wears its peeling paint like a festering wound. Surrounded by the clamor of Copper Junction, the rapidly industrializing town that has metastasized around my boundaries. They call it a city now, a nexus of steel and steam, where the paved streets stop abruptly at my property line, giving way to the sacred dirt I still refuse to smooth over. Every morning, the first metallic shriek of the iron ghost tears through the fragile membrane of my sleep, dragging me back to the day the world changed. It wasn't a slow erosion. It was an avalanche of steel. The railroad's arrival was the death knell of the 1870 year. Oh, the unbound West, I remembered, the West built on handshake deals, an endless horizon. Now the horizon is blocked by grain elevators and telegraph poles, buzzing with chatter I have no desire to understand. I stood now, as I always did, at the periphery of the living room, near the threshold that held the weight of my universe, Caleb's doorstep. The weathered oak was worn smooth, not just by my shuffling feet over 8 decades, but by the endless cycle of expectation and despair. This doorway is where my life froze. My bones ached, a deep, pervasive throbbing that mirrored the structural groaning of the house planks. They were heavy, those aches, weighted by memory. The young people, the ones rushing into this bright, loud future, saw me as an obstacle, a piece of grit in the gleaming machinery of their new century. They didn't know this house wasn't just wood and nails, it was a promise. It was the last ragged tent post of hope I possessed. The noise outside intensified, not just the train, but the incessant, high-pitched whine of saw blades from the new lumber yard being erected 2 blocks over. They were building faster than time could erase, erasing history faster than I could recall it. A shadow fell across the sun-drenched, dust-filled entryway. Not a large shadow, but one that carried the severe, cutting edge of modern intent. A car, sleek and black, a machine that spoke of finance and speed, was idling near my rickety gate. It was her. I watched her approach the porch steps, movements precise, calculated, entirely devoid of the loose-limbed grace that characterized the women of the West. I remembered. This was Eleanor Vance, 42. She was impeccably tailored in a dark suit that defied the heat, always carrying a sleek briefcase that looked too valuable to be opened in the dust of my yard. Eleanor was not a person. She was an instrument of acquisition, a cold calculation wrapped in expensive fabric. She reached the top step, stopping just short of Caleb's doorstep, as if sensing the invisible boundary of my vigil. "Mr. Thorne." Her voice was crisp, dry, like autumn leaves underfoot. It carried no warmth, only professional expectation. I didn't move from my spot. "Miss Vance, the engine must have been running slow. You're early for your weekly disappointment." She allowed herself a brief, practiced smile, a thin stretching of the lips that did not touch her eyes. "I am never early, Mr. Thorne. I am punctual. And this meeting is hardly about disappointments unless you choose to make it so." She set the briefcase down on the railing, the sound sharp and metallic against the ancient wood. "I have brought you a final, updated offer." "The offer hasn't changed, Miss Vance," I stated, my voice slow, sanded down by 80 years of dust and silence. "I want to sell." "Thorne, with all due respect to the sentimental value of this land." She opened the briefcase, pulling out a sheaf of thick, official documents. The smell of fresh ink and expensive paper momentarily overpowered the stale scent of age and wood rot within the house. Sentimental value does not pay taxes. Nor does it protect you from the inevitable. "The inevitable already happened," I countered, stepping toward the light filtering through the grime-streaked window pane. "It was called the railroad's arrival. I survived that. I'll survive this progress you keep talking about." She held up the documents. "This includes the full legal settlement for the eminent domain dispute, contingent upon your voluntary surrender of the Thorne patent." The Thorne patent. The foundational deeds, crisp parchment barely contained by yellowed tape, locked in the safe behind the mantelpiece. They weren't just titles. They were the last vestiges of the unbound spirit. Selling them meant selling the West itself, abandoning the phantom landscape I inhabited. "I told you before," I said, finally crossing the room to stand opposite her, separated by the width of the porch. "This house is not empty land to be developed into another bank or a new trolley depot. This house is occupied. It is waiting." Eleanor Vance sighed, a small, controlled exhalation of professional frustration. "Waiting for a ghost, mister, we both know that. Caleb Thorne, if he is even still alive at 58, has been gone since 1895. 40 years. A lifetime." The mention of the date, 1895, hit harder than any hammer blow. It was the year my future ended, the year my past began its tyrannical reign. Caleb's final walkout. "He left a future I couldn't offer him," I whispered, more to the worn wood of the floorboards than to the calculated woman before me. "He wanted the modern world. He wanted the noise and the concrete. And he found it," Eleanor asserted, her tone softening slightly, calculatingly, to simulate empathy. "The world he walked into has changed, even since he left. He wouldn't recognize Copper Junction now, nor would he recognize you, tethered here. Mr. Life moves forward. You are rooted in a time that no longer exists." She placed the papers on the railing, careful to keep them clean. This offer, Mr. Thorne, is generous. It is your final chance to step into the present with dignity, rather than being dragged into it by court order. The intensity of this encounter, the final land acquisition offer, felt like the climax of a decades-long siege. It wasn't about money. It was about defining the final victory of modernity over the human spirit. I stared past her, toward the distant, shimmering heat haze above the train tracks, where the smoke of the iron ghost coiled into the sky, a permanent scar on the blue. "You don't understand waiting, Miss Vance," I said, picking up the papers and immediately tearing them in half, the sound a ragged echo of the tearing of my own heart 40 years prior. The pristine pieces fluttered to the dirt. "You understand transactions. I understand promises." Eleanor Vance's composure wavered, a flicker of genuine irritation crossing her sharp features. She didn't shout. Professionals like her never did. She merely resecured her briefcase, clicking the lock with a sound of finality. "Very well, mister. The company will proceed through legal channels. Enjoy your antiquity while it lasts." She turned and marched back to her expensive vehicle, leaving behind only the scent of new leather and the dust settling on the torn paper. I watched her drive away, the hum of her engine swallowed instantly by the rising din of the city. I was alone again, left with the silence she had briefly disturbed. My deliberate movements took me back inside, away from the demanding sun and the demanding world. The house was not silent. It spoke in creaks, in the slow settling of the foundations, in the rustle of dry air. These were the voices of memory. I walked to the mantel and retrieved the small, velvet pouch. Inside, cold to the touch, was a tarnished pocket compass. It was small, heavy brass, the glass scratched, the needle forever restless. Caleb Thorne had left this behind on Caleb's doorstep 40 years ago, a symbolic abandonment. He had been so sharp-featured even at 18, with clean lines that suggested he was already planning his city life. His eyes, even then, betrayed a deep internal restlessness, focused on escape and progress, believing the homestead was suffocation. I remember his final words, standing right there, framed in the doorway. "The West is dead, Pa. You just haven't buried it yet. I need a direction that isn't dictated by the sun and the dust." He had wanted direction. He left the compass, the universal symbol of direction, behind. I have spent 40 years trying to decipher that contradiction. Did he leave it because he knew he didn't need a compass to find the future? It was everywhere. Or did he leave it because he secretly hoped I would use it to track him down, to bring him back to the earth he claimed to hate? I ran my thumb over the scarred brass. The world Caleb walked into had swallowed him whole, just as I had feared. I knew this logically. Caleb Thorne, 58 hypothetical age, was likely a successful man somewhere, perhaps in Chicago or San Francisco, dealing in the same stocks and bonds that fueled the engines of the Iron Ghost. He would be pragmatic, ambitious, everything I was not. But logic is a poor consolation for a father's grief. This house demands my vigil. It is the repository of that final hope. I have replayed Caleb's final walkouts so many times. The sound of his boots on the oak, the brief, sharp slam of the door, that the memory is more real than the sight of Copper Junction outside my windows. I sat in my chair, the sunlight illuminating the thick motes of dust dancing in the air, the dust of decades. I realized the true agony of my isolation was not just the waiting, but the fear that if I left, if I sold the land and moved into one of those modern, antiseptic apartments. Eleanor Vance wanted to buy me. Caleb would return to an empty space. If the house were gone, the memory too might crumble. This house, this wreck, was the last remnant of a life built on dust and dreams. The afternoon deepened, and the noise from the city outside became a dense, uniform roar. The grinding of machinery, the distant shouts of workmen, the ceaseless rhythm of the steam engine. They were trying to drown out the silence I cherished. They were trying to erase the 1870 West, not by building over it, but by assaulting the memory with sheer, overwhelming sound. I closed my eyes and tried to conjure the open plains, the smell of sagebrush and wild clover, the sound of wind whipping through grass, not steam whistling through a stack. But the intrusion was too strong. The present was a tyrant. I stood up, moving with my deliberate, aged gait. I had to secure the Thorn patent. Eleanor's threat was real. They would return with papers and police. They viewed history and land purely as capital. And I was holding up a multi-million-dollar transaction simply because of a rusty compass and a ghost. As I opened the safe, pulling out the fragile, brittle deeds, the only thing standing between me and oblivion, I heard a new sound, distinct from the urban clamor, a rhythmic, heavy thumping, coming from directly outside. I moved to the window. 2 large municipal trucks, not Eleanor's sleek sedan, were parked on the edge of my property, followed by a handful of men in thick denim. They carried clipboards and surveying equipment, ignoring the torn papers scattered on the dirt. They were not waiting for the court order. They were claiming the property line, preparing for the inevitable seizure. They began hammering stakes into the earth-marking. The perimeter where the paved streets of Copper Junction would finally, completely envelop the Thorn vigil. This was it. Not a subtle legal maneuver, but a blunt, physical declaration of war. The rage that surged through me was hot, swift, and entirely unexpected. It was the same fire that had driven me as a young man carving out a life in the unbound West, defending my meager existence against nature and man. It was the last desperate flicker of the frontier spirit they claimed was dead. I grabbed the first thing my hand found on the mantel, a heavy, raw iron fire poker, slick with years of soot and disuse. The Thorn patent slipped from my grasp and fell back into the open safe, forgotten for the moment. My movement, usually slow, was propelled by adrenaline and 80 years of pent-up regret. I threw open the front door, stepping onto Caleb's doorstep and onto the battlefield. "Get off my land." My voice was a gravelly roar, surprisingly loud against the clamor. The men stopped, startled by the sight of the old man emerging from the dilapidated house, wielding the primitive weapon. The leader, a stout man with a hard hat, looked annoyed. "Old man, we're just setting the boundary markers for the public right-of-way. We have the permits. Move back inside." "Permits?" I spat the word out. "The only permit you have is the arrogance of the greedy. This land is patented. It's mine." I descended the steps, moving toward the closest surveyor, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. I wasn't thinking about the consequences. I was only thinking about the 4 decades of waiting, the silent promises, and the absolute necessity of keeping this door open for a son who would never arrive. If they destroyed the house, they destroyed the hope, and that would be the true death. "You set one more stake, and I'll bury it through your foot," I threatened, raising the heavy poker. The surveyor stepped back nervously, but the man in the hard hat stood firm, crossing his arms. He wasn't afraid of an 80-year-old man, but he was wary of the paperwork involved. if he had to physically subdue one. Thorn, you need to understand. The city needs this access. You are disrupting commerce. You are a nuisance. A nuisance? I laughed, a harsh, cracking sound. I am a memory, and you are trying to pave over the last honest one left. This was the climax. It wasn't a duel at high noon. It was a pathetic, furious stand against progress with a rusty fireplace tool. But for me it felt like the final, desperate battle for the soul of the West. It was the moment I stopped being merely isolated and became actively resistant to the tide. I swung the poker not intending to hit him, but to shatter the offensive. Gleaming surveying transit set up near the property line. The heavy metal met the glass and brass with a sickening crunch. Shards flew, and the tool of calculated measurement lay broken in the dust. The hard-hatted man finally moved, lunging to grab my arms. The ensuing struggle was brief, brutal, and humiliating. My strength, fueled by rage, was quickly overcome by the younger man's bulk. He didn't hurt me, but he pinioned my arms, forcing the poker from my grasp. It clattered against the ground, silent now. "Call the sheriff," the supervisor ordered, breathing heavily. My energy evaporated, leaving me trembling and profoundly ashamed. I was defeated, not by bullets or drought, but by the relentless, organized force of regulation and construction. They had won. The West, and I with it, was finally pinned down. They released me, and I stumbled back, leaning heavily against the railing of my own porch, watching as the supervisor picked up a new transit from the truck. The installation of the boundary markers continued, ignoring my tears, ignoring the torn land acquisition papers in the dirt. I retreated inside, dragging my defeat across Caleb's doorstep. The house felt cold now, the groaning planks sounding less like familiar voices and more like the dying gasps of a trapped animal. The thorn patent lay exposed in the safe. It was useless now. They would take the land, regardless of the parchment. Paper was merely suggestion to the engines of modernity. I moved to my chair, collapsing into the worn leather. The light was fading, turning the dust motes orange. I picked up a tarnished pocket compass again. I opened the brass lid, staring at the needle. It spun erratically, catching the last light. In that moment of absolute, exhausted silence, after the futile explosion of resistance, the truth finally pierced the layers of grief and stubborn hope I had built around myself. Caleb's final walkout hadn't been a temporary departure. It hadn't been an invitation to wait. He hadn't left the compass for me to follow. He had left it because he had moved past the need for direction itself. He had abandoned the past, and he had abandoned me, not out of malice, but out of necessity. The vigil was over. The house wasn't waiting for Caleb. I was, and by waiting here, I had become exactly what Eleanor Vance accused me of being, a relic, defined by an absence that would never be filled. The phantom landscape of the past, the boundless West of 1870, existed only within the walls of my head, and now even those walls were being dismantled. I looked down at the compass in my hand. It was time to choose a final, different direction. Not escape, but acceptance. I walked to the safe, pulled out the thorn patent, and also retrieved a small iron box containing dried remnants of Caleb's childhood, a rusted tin soldier, a lock of baby hair. I didn't return to the doorstep. The threshold was too heavy with failed hope. Instead, I went into the kitchen, found the ancient, soot-stained wood stove, and built a small fire. One by one, I fed the documents to the flame. The thorn patent, the legal foundation of my defiance, crackled, curling into black ash. The historical maps I had inherited, charting the unspoiled land, turned to smoke. As the last pieces of paper dissolved into heat, I held a tarnished pocket compass over the small fire. I did not throw it in. Instead, I tucked it back into its velvet pouch. It was no longer a symbol of waiting, but a quiet, sharp reminder of the profound regret that had shaped the last half-century. I walked back to the front room and sat down in the fading light. The men outside were gone, their boundary markers planted like triumphant flags. Soon the noise would return, and the building would begin. But I would not fight them. The fight was over. The house would fall, and the West would be paved over. I am an old man, Silas Thorne, 80, defined by absence. But the absence was no longer a question. It was a certainty. I had finally buried the phantom, the son who would never return, and in doing so, I had finally, irrevocably, buried the West. The engine of progress roared its final victory from the tracks, but this time its sound felt distant, irrelevant. I had accepted the silence of my own defeat. The West was left behind, swept away by time's tide, and I, too, was a forgotten island, finally content to sink beneath the sea of relentless, calculating progress. My vigil was done. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 40 years, I stopped listening for the sound of boots on the doorstep. The scent of scorched paper and the faint, acrid bitterness of burning ink hung low in the living room, a funeral haze surrounding the wrought iron stove. The heat was negligible, but the action was absolute. I stood motionless, watching the last sliver of the patent vanish, the brittle legal claim to this dust and memory turning into nothingness. The shame of my outburst, the futile, desperate attack on the surveyor's transit, had faded, leaving behind a deeper, cleansing exhaustion. It was the exhaustion, not of labor, but of 80 years spent fighting a tide I should have learned to swim with, or at least acknowledged. The surveyors had gone, taking their shattered equipment and leaving their markers like freshly dug graves lining my property. The dirt around those stakes was still raw, freshly turned, and it seemed to bleed the last warmth from the afternoon sun. I sank back into my chair, the worn leather sighing beneath my weight, a sound that always felt like the house, confirming its mutual burden. My hands, which had gripped the iron poker with a brief, terrifying conviction, now lay slack on my knees, the skin rough as old timber, incapable of further resistance. The silence that settled was heavier and more pervasive than any quiet I had known in 40 years. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of finality. For decades, the noise of copper junction, the hiss of the steam lines, the relentless clang of the train, the shouts of the newly industrialized world had been my tormentor, the constant, audible proof of my defeat. It was the screaming victory of the present over the past. But now, after I had burned the deeds and accepted the loss of hope, the sounds outside changed their meaning. They were no longer insults. They were simply the irrelevant background noise of a world I no longer wished to engage with. The cacophony had been stripped of its power. I had been waiting for Caleb to return to the West, the unbound, rugged, honest place of 1870 that only existed in my mind. But that West, I realized now, had been merely a phase, a volatile, necessary moment between the wilderness and the inevitable regulation of 1935. I hadn't been defending a way of life. I had been defending a ghost town built of memory, stubbornly refusing to acknowledge that the only resident was me. I pulled the velvet pouch from my pocket and slid a tarnished pocket compass into my palm. The brass was cool, reassuringly weighty. I studied the restless needle, forever oscillating, seeking a direction it could never find while static on my palm. The true cruelty of Caleb's departure was not his leaving, but the implication of his leaving, that the land, the foundation of my entire identity, was directionless. He wanted a future defined by lines on a map that weren't dirt roads leading back home. He wanted the grid, the calculated precision Eleanor represented. He saw the homestead not as a sanctuary, but as a circular prison, a loop of predictable sunrises and sunsets. I remembered the feel of the compass, cold in my son's hand. The day he left in 1895, he was 18. Too young to fully understand the permanence of his choice, but old enough to make the break clean. His eyes, intense and restless, had been focused only on the far-off horizon of the future, ignoring the dust beneath his boots. "You left the compass, son," I whispered to the empty room, my voice hoarse. "You left the idea of return." For 40 years, I had held on to the narcissistic belief that the compass was a breadcrumb, a small, subtle message that he intended to reverse course, that he needed the anchor of the house to ground his exploration. But the truth, clear now under the heavy light of absolute despair, was simpler and far more devastating. Caleb had no need for direction because he knew exactly where he was going away. He left the compass not as a signpost, but as a definitive, symbolic rejection of the fixed coordinative system that had been my life. He didn't want the West, he wanted the world. And the world, the one he walked into, had indeed swallowed him whole. I had held the vigil because I feared that if I left, if I moved, Caleb would return and find nothing. But what if Caleb had returned 40 years ago, seen the nascent copper junction, seen the telegraph wires, heard the train, and simply kept walking? What if he recognized that the West he fled was still clinging on, personified by the very man who wouldn't let him go? He would have seen the house as proof of my stagnation, not my love. My movement was governed by a profound stiffness, the accumulated tension of holding vigil melting into a permanent ache. I stood up and walked the perimeter of the living room, touching the surfaces of the house, not as a warden safeguarding a relic, but as a man offering a final, silent apology to a dying friend. The planks of the thorn vigil groaned beneath my feet, no longer the sound of enduring structure, but the slow, heavy settling of decay. I ran my hand over the rough-hewn mantelpiece. This wood had been felled by my own father, split and shaped by hands that believed in permanence. They built this home on the premise that the West was an endless expanse of possibility, that the earth itself was the only currency that mattered. Now I was surrounded by brick and regulation. The new buildings of Copper Junction, visible through the grime-streaked windows, stood sharp and precise, rectangles of calculated utility. They were soulless, built quickly to serve a temporary, volatile boom. They possessed none of the stubborn character of my home. Yet they were winning. Their geometry was the language of the future, and my groaning planks were a dead tongue. I thought of Eleanor. Her eyes, cold and focused on the bottom line, never saw the house. She saw potential square footage, infrastructure costs, and quarterly profits. She viewed history as an obstacle to be bulldozed, and land as purely capital. In the moment I tore up her offer, I felt a flash of righteous satisfaction, a last stand for sentiment. But tearing the paper did nothing. Her legal machinery was already in motion. Her world was of fact, immutable and indifferent to my personal narratives. I walked into the small, dusty study, where the records of my life lay in haphazard stacks. Yellowed ledgers, detailing crops that failed, livestock that froze, and the relentless, losing battle against the elements. These were the documents of the unbound West, a place where survival was a daily negotiation with chaos. Modernity promised order, predictability, and safety. Caleb chose safety. And I chose the beautiful, brutal, inevitable chaos. I picked up a faded photograph of Caleb as a boy, sharp-featured even then, leaning against the fence line. He looked impatient, even then, eager for a horizon that didn't smell of cattle and dust. I realized the true essence of the regret that had defined me. I regretted that I couldn't change for him. I couldn't transform the dirt into concrete, the silence into commerce, the hard life into the easy one. My love was tethered to the land, and my failure was thinking his love should be too. The profound isolation I felt was self-imposed. I had built the walls not just of this house, but of my own prison, using the phantom landscape of the past as the mortar. I moved back toward the kitchen, the remnants of the fire still warm in the stove. I had to continue the process of dismantling the hope, piece by piece. The contents of the iron box, the dried remnants of Caleb's childhood lay, scattered on the table. The rusted tin soldier, missing a bayonet, the lock of baby hair, pale as wheat, a crude, whittled wooden horse. These were the relics that tied me to the memory of the child, not the man who walked out. I had cherished them as evidence of the time when he belonged solely to me, before the future called him away. The tin soldier went first. It clattered against the iron grate, a tiny, metallic sound of surrender. The small flame licked at the paint, turning the crude red uniform black. I watched the metal soften and warp, folding in upon itself, becoming unrecognizable. Then the wooden horse. It caught quickly, smelling sweet and sharp, the scent of burning cedar briefly overpowering the smell of ash. It was a rapid cremation of innocence. I hesitated, only briefly, over the lock of hair. It felt morbid somehow to destroy something so purely organic, but it too represented the time when the possibility of Caleb's final walkout did not exist. I dropped it into the heat. It flashed instantaneously, a brief, bright puff of smoke, and was gone. Now the box was empty. The physical symbols of my connection to a time before 1895 were neutralized. I sat there for a long time, the darkness deepening outside. The glow of Copper Junction was visible through the window, a diffused orange smog against the sky. It was a man-made luminescence, defiance against the natural dark. In the West of 1870, the nights were absolute, filled only with the vast, impersonal sprawl of stars. The new light was a statement. Man had conquered the night, just as he had conquered the land. I walked slowly back to the front door, to Caleb's doorstep. It was the final destination, the symbolic heart of the vigil. The threshold was cold beneath my worn shoes. I stood there, not waiting, but simply observing the spot where the break had occurred. This oak was the boundary between my world of dust and his world of speed. I reached out and touched the wood of the doorframe. I pictured him standing there, his back to me, the light of that forgotten day shining around his silhouette. He was the future walking away from the past. I, stationary, was the past refusing to die. I finally understood the full scope of my isolation. The problem wasn't that the world left me behind. The problem was that I actively refused to move. I was so profoundly focused on the external threat of progress that I failed to see the internal decay of my own spirit. The West hadn't just been swallowed by modernity. It had committed a slow, intentional suicide by clinging too tightly to its own definition. I stood on the doorstep, feeling the cool night air for the first time, without the reflexive impulse to draw the door closed, to seal myself away from the external world. There was nothing left to protect. I closed my eyes and allowed the full spectrum of the city's noise to wash over me. The constant, metallic drone of production. The faint, high-pitched laughter of people in the new entertainment districts, and the heavy, rhythmic chuffing of the iron ghost pulling freight through the night. The train had always been the sound of my defeat. Now, in this moment of utter, non-resistant acceptance, the sound shifted again. It was just an engine, a force of nature, yes, a change agent, but ultimately morally neutral. It was not screaming victory over me. It was simply moving. The bitterness dissolved. I had internalized the fight, turning a mechanical process into a personal enemy. I reached into the velvet pouch one last time. I opened a tarnished pocket compass and held it up to the dim light filtering from the windows. The needle, usually so agitated, seemed momentarily stilled. The true acceptance came with the recognition that the compass was not a challenge, nor a clue, nor an object of hope. It was just a reminder that once a young man needed a new direction, and he'd found it far away from here. It was a mute object testifying to a completed journey, his journey, and the 40-year failure of mine to begin. I tucked the compass away. I would keep it not as a symbol of waiting, but as a quiet, heavy memory of the cost of fierce, unyielding love. I stepped back inside the house, crossing the threshold for the very last time with purpose, not expectation. My pace was slow, deliberate, the gait of a man who no longer had to rush, who no longer had anything to defend. The house was cold, but the cold was no longer oppressive. It was simply temperature. I moved to the large, bay window that faced the encroaching city. I didn't see Eleanor or the surveyors now. I saw a system, functional and alive. I saw a future, indifferent to my past, but demanding to be acknowledged. I realized I didn't have to wait for the demolition crew. I didn't have to wait for the court order that would inevitably follow the burnt deeds. My vigil was done. I had buried Caleb's ghost, and with it, the 1870 West that had been my only reality. I sat in my chair one final time, looking round the room. The dust motes, illuminated by the distant city glow, danced like tiny detached spirits. The groaning of the planks was softer now, a gentle, tired sound. I would leave in the morning, not fleeing, not being dragged, but choosing my own direction, 40 years too late, but choosing it nonetheless. I would walk away from the threshold, away from the dust, and into the paved world. The world, Eleanor promised, antiseptic, regulated, clean, was waiting. It wasn't the West, but it was reality. The West was gone, swept away by time's tide, and I had fought too long to remain a forgotten island. Now, I was ready to sink, not with despair, but with the quiet dignity of a man who has finally finished his duty to a memory. I closed my eyes. The sounds of progress outside continued, relentless and unwavering. But now they were just sounds, empty of judgment. I had made my peace. The doorstep was finally free of its burden. I was free. The house was finally quiet, a heavy, velvet cloak of silence draped over 40 years of unspoken conflict. The inner clamor, the desperate justifications, the self-pity, the raging against the visible manifestation of the iron ghost all had receded, leaving behind a bedrock of weary clarity. I sat there, watching the dust motes settle on the scarred wooden table, the air thick with the faint scent of ash and finality. The outside world had been reduced, not by distance, but by perspective. Copper Junction was no longer an antagonist. It was an environment. It breathed, it pulsed, it consumed. I rose again, my movements no longer driven by the frantic energy of resistance, but by a heavy, methodological purpose. I had a few hours left before the dawn, before I enacted the choice I had finally allowed myself to make. This time would be spent not dwelling on the past, but recognizing it for what it was, a finished story, bound within these groaning planks. I walked toward the kitchen, my footsteps echoing softly on the worn floorboards that my mother had polished with beeswax, boards that had seen 3 generations of life and ambition. I opened the pantry door. The shelves were mostly bare, a few tins of beans, a bag of coarse flour, forgotten jars of preserved peaches that had long since crystallized into inedible sugar monuments. The smell of the pantry was the smell of scarcity and endurance, the true aroma of the unbound West of 1870. It was a smell that Caleb had always found bitter, a reminder of the relentless struggle that modernity promised to abolish. He wanted the world of refrigeration and canned goods, the convenience of commerce. I wanted the self-sufficiency of the soil. I could never understand that he didn't view that self-sufficiency as freedom, but as a tedious, back-breaking sentence. He saw the necessity of a garden as a failure to harness the larger economic machine. I closed the pantry door gently. The latch clicked, a small, definitive sound. I moved through the house, room by room, an 80-year-old museum curator preparing for liquidation. The front parlor, rarely used, still held the stiffness of formality. The heavy velvet drapes, faded from decades of western sun, hung like tired flags. In the corner sat the old parlor organ, its keys yellowed and silent, a testament to my mother's brief, futile attempt to bring culture to the frontier. Caleb used to press the keys down when he was small, trying to produce a chord, always succeeding only in creating a mournful, wheezing sigh. I touched the dusty wood of the organ. Caleb, at 5 years old, saw that organ not as music, but as an exotic import, a fragile piece of the East that was constantly fighting the dry, brutal reality of the plains. Even then, he understood the fundamental incompatibility between the life we lived and the life the world promised. I ran my finger over the keys, raising a plume of fine grey dust. I remembered the conversation I had with him, the day he asked why we didn't just move closer to the rails, why we didn't join the rising tide. "This is our ground, son," I told him, my voice carrying the weight of my father's belief. "This is where we stand. You sell the land, you sell yourself." He had looked at me with that sharp, assessing gaze that belied his 18 years, the look that Eleanor later perfected, the gaze that calculated intrinsic value against market value. He saw the dirt, and I saw the destiny. He left in 1895, searching for a place where destiny was calculated on a ledger, not carved out of rock and hope. The clock in the hall chimed once, a deep, resonant strike that seemed to vibrate in the very timbers of the house. It was long past midnight. The city outside, however, showed no deference to the hour. The glow was steady. The hum was persistent. I ascended the main staircase. The central plank, the one near the landing, always creaked precisely when weight was placed upon it. Creak, it was the signature sound of the Thorn Vigil. It was the sound that had alerted me to Caleb's final walkout 40 years ago. He thought he was being silent, slipping down the stairs in the pre-dawn dark of 1895, his cheap canvas bag slung over his shoulder. But that one plank, worn by years of traffic, gave him away. I had stood at the top of the stairs, not moving, allowing him the dignity of thinking he had escaped unseen. I heard the door open, the brief rush of cold air, and the decisive clunk of the door closing, separating our timelines forever. That sound, the clunk, had been the boundary of my entire life since. Everything before was possibility, everything after was surveillance. Now, as I crossed that plank, it issued its familiar melancholic cry. But tonight, it felt like a greeting, not a warning. It was the sound of a story reaching its final page. I went into Caleb's old room. It was sparse, the iron bed frame still there, covered by a sheet I had laid down 30 years ago to protect it from the worst of the dust. The room smelled dry, preserved, like dried flowers pressed in a heavy book. On the wall, faded outlines showed where posters of modern engineering marvels bridges. Early automobiles had once been tacked up, signs of the future he craved. I sat on the edge of the bed. It protested beneath me, a series of muted squeaks. This room was where the tension started, where the quiet rebellion against the soil first took root. I remembered hearing him up here late at night, his oil lamp burning, tracing maps, studying diagrams, absorbing every detail of the world that lay beyond the horizon of this homestead. He wasn't dreaming of bigger farms. He was dreaming of concrete and steel, of complex systems that couldn't be ruined by a single hailstorm or a dry summer. I had been blind. I had mistaken his ambition for restlessness, his need for systemic order for a temporary youthful folly. I thought the land would call him back, that the blood ties to the 1870 foundation would prove stronger than the siren song of progress. "You won, Caleb," I murmured to the empty room. "Your world won." I left the room undisturbed, pulling the sheet back over the mattress. Next was my own room. I paused at the bureau. I pulled out a single, neatly folded piece of aged cotton. It was his baby blanket, too large to have fit in the small iron box of relics. It was the only tangible object left of the innocent past. I held it to my face. It carried no scent now, only the faint metallic tong of oxidized dust. I walked to the window. From this vantage point, the proximity of Copper Junction was inescapable. I could see the high, rhythmic sweep of the beacon from the municipal water tower, a lighthouse guiding ships through a desert of commerce. Below, the windows of the factory floors were brightly lit. Tiny squares of tireless industry, creating wealth from calculation. I thought of Eleanor. She would be asleep in her regulated, modern apartment, secure in the knowledge that her legal team was already preparing the final filings against the homestead. She was the absolute antithesis of the unbound West. She wasn't fighting nature. She was fighting people who couldn't keep up with her spreadsheets. She wasn't greedy, not exactly. She was merely efficient. She viewed land not as history, but as inefficiency that needed to be optimized. In her world, there was no room for 80-year-old men waiting for ghosts. I refolded the cotton and placed it back in the bureau drawer. I didn't burn it. I didn't need to destroy the memory. I only needed to stop allowing it to define my immediate future. The blanket was just cloth now, a historical footnote, not an anchor. My attention turned to the last symbolic act of severance. The deeds were burned. The small relics were ash. The house itself stood as the final monument. I needed an action that showed I was leaving voluntarily, that I was not merely being evicted by Eleanor or forced out by the train. I needed to cut the route. I descended the stairs again. The hour was late. The air was becoming colder as the deepest part of the night approached. I grabbed the heavy shovel from the mudroom. It was the same shovel my father had used to first break this stubborn ground in the 1870s. The handle was smooth from decades of use, the metal blade worn thin and polished by friction with the earth. I pulled on a heavy coat and stepped outside. The night air hit me, sharp, dry, and cold. The moon, nearly full, cast long, deep shadows that made the encroaching city lines look like jagged, mechanical teeth. I walked past the dark footprint where the old corral used to stand, now just a stretch of uneven ground. I headed to the western boundary of the property, the line that had been argued over, defended, and defined by the struggle of the unbound West. Near the fence line, half buried in the tall, stiff weeds that persisted even through the fall, was the oldest marker of the property. A flat, grey riverstone, about the size of a man's head, engraved crudely with the initials of my father and the year 1870. It was the true, original patent, not the fragile paper kept in the house, but the physical declaration of sovereignty. It was the embodiment of the belief that this land was ours forever. I knelt down in the dirt, the cold seeping through my worn trousers. I laid the shovel aside. My hands, rough as tree bark, brushed away the dirt and dried grass from the stone. The 1870 was barely visible, etched deep into the hard rock. This stone represented the entire, beautiful, devastating mistake. It was the absolute, non-negotiable definition of the past I refused to relinquish. My father had placed it here with the solemn conviction that this physical claim would outlast all empires and all progress. I picked up the shovel. I started to dig, slowly at first, working around the perimeter of the stone, cutting through 40 years of root systems and compacted earth. The labor felt right, the final, honest interaction with the soil. It was the work of a farmer, not a sentinel. As I dug deeper, the sound of the shovel hitting rocks and roots was small, private noise swallowed by the enormous, indifferent sound of the city behind me. The iron ghost chuffed loudly in the distance, pulling a heavy load eastward, carrying the products and the energy of Copper Junction into the wide paved world. The deep, rhythmic digging began to loosen the tension in my chest that had been coiled there since 1895. It was a kind of physical prayer, a final act of devotion to the land, performed not to hold it, but to release it. The stone was heavy, cold, and immensely stubborn. I worked the shovel underneath it, finally finding the necessary leverage. This was the climax, the moment of absolute, irreversible surrender. With a profound, noiting sound of friction, the marker stone tore free from the earth. The roots that had clung to it snapped, sharp and brittle. I felt a jarring shock run up my arms, a physical jolt that mirrored the internal shift. The stone, wet earth clinging to its underside, lay beside the hole, exposed. It looked vulnerable, suddenly small. It was no longer a monument. It was just a rock. The power I had given it, the conviction that it held the binding contract of my life, was dissolved. I picked up the stone, holding its immense weight in my arms. It was heavier than I remembered, or perhaps I was simply weaker. I looked toward the lights of Copper Junction. The industrial glow seemed to press down on the land, eradicating the true night sky. I realized that my father's belief that the stone and the earth were the ultimate truth was simply outdated. The new truth was paperwork, metal, and steam. It was the relentless, calculating geometry of Eleanor's world. I carried the stone back towards the center of the yard, near the old, dried-up well. I didn't want the stone to be found by the surveyors. It was mine, and my father's, and it deserved a burial. I used the shovel to widen the hole I had already started near the well, a deeper, cleaner excavation. I lowered the rock into the fresh earth. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. I filled the hole, packing the soil back down with the flat of the shovel. It took 10 minutes of focused, back-breaking work. When I was finished, there was nothing to see but a patch of newly turned dirt. The 1870 West, the foundation of my life, was covered. I stood up, wiping the cold sweat and dirt from my brow. I had buried my birthright, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement. The sense of release was startling. It wasn't happiness, but the quiet, deep satisfaction of having finally finished a task that had been neglected for 40 years. I had not abandoned the West. I had simply recognized that the West had evolved into something else, and my duty to the old version was complete. I walked back into the thorn vigil. The air inside was warm compared to the biting cold outside, but the house felt utterly empty now, hollowed out by my final acceptance. I returned the shovel to the mudroom. I went to the bureau and took out a clean shirt and my best, though still threadbare, wool coat. I put them on slowly, deliberately. I put on my good boots, the ones I hadn't worn since the last time I traveled into Copper Junction years ago. They felt strangely stiff, unused to prolonged walking. The only items I took were practical. A small pouch of silver coins, enough to get me a bed and food for a week or two while I figured out the mechanics of the regulative world. And, finally, a tarnished pocket compass. I held the brass sphere in my hand, feeling the weight. The restlessness of the needle was less irritating now. It was no longer an indictment of my static life, but a simple mechanical truth. I tucked it into the inner pocket of my coat, the same pocket that Caleb had used to carry maps of the future. I walked through the house one last time, my final circuit. The living room, the kitchen, the empty rooms upstairs. There was no sentimentality left, only observation. The house was ready to be taken. Its purpose was served. I arrived at Caleb's doorstep. I opened the door. The air outside was cold, carrying the faint metallic scent of coal smoke and progress. I stepped across the threshold. I didn't turn my back on the house immediately. I stood on the porch, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders. This house, this vigil, had demanded my attention for 40 years. It had stood as a fortress against time and change. Now it looked frail, the peeling paint and groaning planks finally succumbing to the reality of 1935. It was a dying friend, and I was granting it the peace of final rest. I stepped off the porch and onto the dirt path. The dirt of the homestead, the raw, familiar soil, was cold beneath my boots. I walked the perimeter of the house, looking at the windows, the darkened glass reflecting the distant orange glow of Copper Junction. I paused at the spot where I had buried the 1870 stone. The earth was slightly mounded, an unmarked grave for an entire era. I began to walk toward the fence line that separated my property from the paved extension of the city. I was walking into the dawn. The eastern sky was beginning to pale, mixing the manufactured orange light of the city with the cool, natural blues of the rising sun. As I reached the end of the dirt path, I stopped at the boundary where the crude asphalt began. The transition was stark, rough, uneven earth giving way to the cold, uniform, level precision of the pavement. I stood on the edge of the paved road for a long moment. My shadow stretched long behind me, thin and fragile in the nascent light. It pointed back toward the homestead, toward the past. I stepped onto the asphalt. The material felt unfamiliar beneath my feet, hard, unyielding, and totally separate from the earth beneath it. It was the future, synthesized and measured. I did not look back again. I knew if I looked back I would see the house, the empty doorstep, and the 50 years of my life frozen in that frame. I walked forward. The sounds of Copper Junction intensified as I drew closer. The rhythmic metallic shunting from the rail yard, the distant ringing of a trolley, the specific high-frequency whine of an industrial saw. It was a symphony of production, loud, impersonal, and entirely focused on what lay ahead. I walked past the first street lamps, tall standards casting cones of clean, artificial light. I passed the first standardized street signs, white letters on dark green metal, calculated and legible. I saw the early risers, men and women in structured, modern clothing, hurrying toward the factories and offices. They moved quickly, their faces focused on the day's utility. They didn't see me, the relic in the dusty coat, walking slowly out of the dark toward their light. They saw only the movement of the present. I thought of Caleb again. He had left in 1895 to walk into this. He didn't walk into a wilderness. He walked into an evolving system. He wanted the challenge of calculating success, not fighting the chaos of nature. I reached the heart of Copper Junction, where the noise was overwhelming and the air tasted of sulfur and steam. The architecture here was vertical, geometric, designed for volume and speed. It was precisely what Eleanor valued, and precisely what I had fought against. I paused at a street corner. The iron ghost roared past on the elevated tracks above the street, a magnificent, terrifying machine of iron and heat. It was faster, louder, and more relentless than ever before. It shook the pavement beneath my feet, but the sound was just sound. It was the movement of the world, and for the first time in 40 years, I was moving too. I reached into my inner coat pocket and touched a tarnished pocket compass. I still had no fixed direction in the new world, no immediate plan. I was 80 years old, cut adrift from my lifelong anchor, facing a future entirely alien. But I was free of the vigil. I was free of the waiting. The West was gone, swept away by time's tide, and I, too, was a forgotten island, finally choosing to sink into the sea of relentless progress, ready to see what the depths contained. I turned onto a new street, walking with the slow but steady gait of a man who has finally found his true pace, no longer defined by the threshold he refused to cross. I was simply a man walking into the dawn, ready to find out if the modern world had a place for someone who had fought so fiercely to remain outside of it. The past was buried in the dirt of the homestead. The future was here, on the pavement. And I, finally, was here too. Subscribe and like to officially join the crew.